My uncle was a World War II veteran, and he has an amazing story because he was shot in the line of duty in the head. Now, normally that'd end your life. However, for my uncle, it did the opposite. He wound up in hospital and they operated to get the bullet out. And in the process, they found a tumour and they were able to operate and get the tumour out. Ironically, my uncle being shot in the head saved his life. The reason I tell this story is that sometimes when we're dealing with one thing, we can ignore another. With all the noise of war and being on the front line and being part of all that, any kind of symptoms he was experiencing were being pushed aside. There was too much else going on. And it wasn't until one thing happened that it led to this sort of snowball effect, if you like, where they discovered more and were able to save his life. We've recently had an experience in our home where we've discovered that my son is ADHD. And we hadn't picked this. And I think part of the reason we hadn't picked this was that it's only really started presenting in more obvious ways in the last 12 months or so. But also we've been so focused on obviously my daughter's needs that we kind of dismissed it. For my son, it's simply ADHD. We're pretty convinced there's no signs of him being autistic. There's no other conditions that are accompanying it at this point that we can tell. But we had a couple of things happen and it started me questioning, what's going on, why is he behaving like this suddenly? I was speaking to my good friend Chris from the Grumpy Gits. We've obviously talked about his ADHD quite a lot on this channel. I'll put a link to the playlist up here and you can check that out. But one of the things that he said was, do you think he might be ADHD? And I was like, no, we'd have picked it up by now. My life is spent in this neurodivergent world. We'd have noticed. And I spent a couple of days just watching and realising that my son's traits were really actually quite obvious once I looked. I spoke to my wife and said, this has been suggested. What do you think? And she had the same response as me. No, it's not that. And within a day, she came back to me and said, actually, you know what, I've been watching. And yeah, I think he might be. We went to his school. We spoke to his teacher. It was a parent-teacher evening. And it was one of those things that they always ask the question, is there anything you want to discuss first? And it was like, well, actually, yeah, we do. We think he might be ADHD. And her response was, oh, yes, of course. Which left us kind of like, really? Why has no one mentioned this to us? Why has no one called and said, look, we're thinking this might be the case? She was like, oh, yeah, ADHD for sure. And it set us on this, pathway to getting my son diagnosed for ADHD. And we had to make some decisions. My son is in year 4. It means he's got about 2.5 years left in primary school before he makes the shift to high school. We know with ADHD, it's manageable and it's something that he can deal with now more than he will be able to when that transition happens. The way that high school operates so differently, it's not a healthy place if you're ADHD. We know the waiting lists. We know how long they are. It took us 8 years to get my daughter diagnosed, let alone, going through what he's going through. The waiting lists are ridiculous these days. They just seem to be getting worse. Country's falling apart. We all know it. So we decided for this one we were going to go private, simply because it meant we could get a quick turnaround and we'd know the answers and we could start supporting him. So we did that. We found a place that they came recommended and they were NHS approved, so they actually do on the right to choose. They're part of the right to choose list, so that they can diagnose for the NHS as well. So it all fit with what we wanted. Within a couple of weeks, basically, we were having the assessment, and it was done on the internet. It was done over like a Teams or a Zoom call. It's really the light bulb moment of it really came in that assessment when they started asking the questions, and we were like, oh yeah, he does do that. Oh yes, he does do that. It was like, is he never able to sit still? And we know the school have said to us in the past, it's difficult to keep him in his seat. But we thought that was, he's 8. It's not, he's 7, 6. He's just being, who he is. As I say, the ADHD hadn't presented itself in a really obvious form until we really started picking up on the escalation, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it. We realised he never sits still. He doesn't even sit still to eat. He eats as he's walking around doing stuff. He's very focused on gaming, which is, like most kids are, but we know it's something that can really accompany ADHD. It's one of those things that becomes a hyperfocus. Hyperfocus is a big feature of ADHD. If you want to learn more about that, I'll put a link up in the description. We started piecing all these things together and really seeing this does add up. And as we were going through the assessment, I kept flicking the camera around just so that she could see what he was doing, that the assessor could see what Curtis was doing in the background. She talked to him a few times, but he couldn't sit there for long, and he was jumping around. He couldn't have been more ADHD in that hour, hour and a half that we were on the call with her. And she got to me and said, yeah, like it's actually really obvious. You flicking the camera around really helped because I could actually see the behaviours and the, what he's doing. Totally adds up. Now, we've opted to use meds for my son. We've done that for a couple of reasons. One is that my knowledge of meds is actually a lot better than it used to be. I've always been reluctant to just throw meds at a situation. However, through the conversations with Chris that we had, where he talked about going on medication, the difference it made for him and how he wished he'd had it when he was a kid, we thought this might be something we need to do. And they have made a remarkable difference. We notice his ADHD a lot more in the evenings now, because he's been sort of not placid, but it's been balanced through the day. So we know of ADHD. We talked about it before. It's to do with dopamine. You can check out the interview we did with Alan Smith, who was my best man, and he spoke about his late diagnosis. Check out the ones with Chris where we talk about it. Basically, dopamine is the most likely reason ADHD exists. The brain isn't producing it in a balanced amount. So the dopamine's there, but it's not enough to keep us focused. Dopamine is what keeps us focused on anything that we're doing. The reason a lot of ADHDers have hyperfocus is because once you find that thing you do love, it sets the dopamine off and the brain's got, oh, I want more of that. And so they become hyper-focused. The problem is that it doesn't always last. So they'll hyper-focus on one thing for a while and it will shift to the next as the interest wanes and the dopamine reduces. So it's looking for the next dopamine hit. We know that the way that ADHD meds work is that they help balance the dopamine so that it's actually there during the day for things that you need to do. The reason that he couldn't focus on schoolwork and he couldn't sit down in his seat was that he was just getting bored. That's what ADHD is. It's essentially you're bored, so you're looking for the next thing, and it comes across in this hyperactive way. And he does loads of things, like he's always climbing up doorways. He's this shimmy thing up the side of the doors. He's like Spider-Man. What I was worried about was that we'd lose that part of him in a way. If we were to, is medication going to stop him being who he really is? The good news is no, it hasn't. He's still very much his cheeky, funny, humorous self. He's a really funny kid. No, I love that about him. He's still quite adventurous. He still goes running off here and there, but when it comes to needing to focus, he can do it. We seem to have hit the right balance there. So it hasn't taken that spark out of his character. What it has done is allowed him to be able to focus when he needs to. But what that means is that in the evenings, he's a lot more hyperactive. We've had issues with sleep, and they're working on that at the moment. So we're, obviously melatonin is basically, I think the med inhibits the melatonin, and the melatonin is the hormone our brain secretes to let us know it's time to get into that routine for bed. You can check out more on melatonin here. So it started me questioning is why hadn't I picked up on this before? And there's a couple of things that really struck me. One of them is that obviously I work in this arena now. I do these videos. I'm an ambassador for so many different pro-neurodivergent charities and organisations. But it's that thing of you can have two torches. You can have one that's quite not very bright and one that's really bright. And if you focus them both on the same spot, the bright one's going to dominate. That's all you're going to see. And it's not until you start moving that bright one away that you see there's this lesser light that's in the middle of it being produced by the other torch. That's kind of the situation we were in with our kids. My daughter's needs were so obvious and so present that it became the real focus of this is what we do. Not that we were ignoring our son. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that her traits were so obvious that it was easy to focus on them and easy to start working on them. Because his ADHD is so much less affecting him, it kind of slipped under the radar, if you like. We didn't realise that he was experiencing this until we did, until somebody pointed it out to us. Basically, the needs that my daughter has have become less because we've been working through so much and we're managing things so much better. And she's in such a much better place than she has been in the past. And suddenly I think that light started to fade so that his light became a little more clear. And we realised this is what's going on. And it makes sense to me. We know that the most likely reason anyone's going to be autistic or neurodivergent is it's genetic. It's part of the genetic process that follows through. It comes back to this whole thing. There's nothing wrong with being neurodivergent. In fact, it's a benefit in so many ways. We just need to adapt our world to work with it. My son will always be ADHD, but what we're doing now is to help him to manage that. And certainly into the transition to high school in a couple of years, it'll be a lot easier for him. What he wants to do with that when he goes forward is up to him. If he chooses that I don't want to be on ADHD meds at any point, it will be like, okay, that's his choice when he's old enough to make those kind of decisions, obviously. We won't judge that at all. We want him to be who he is, how he wants to be. That's not a problem. ADHD isn't a problem. But, he doesn't need to be in a SEND school. He's not in that sort of situation. He just needs something to help him manage through the school days as he is. And it seems to be really working. All this triggered my thinking of, I remember someone saying to me that, just make sure you are keeping an eye just to see if there's any autistic traits. And I think maybe that's the other thing is we're so focused on autism, I suppose, that we didn't recognise the ADHD so much as it was coming out. We keep having conversations now, which is, how did we not see this? It's become so obvious. We're like, how did we not see this before? And I do think there's been an escalation over the last sort of 12 months or so, and we started seeing more and more. The good thing is we got there. We did notice, and we were in a position where we could get it, diagnosed quickly, and that was a real benefit. If anyone's going through this, there are options out there. Research it on Google and just do a search engine search on ADHD diagnosis. Make sure that anybody that you're dealing with is NHS recognised, because that will obviously have an impact down the track when it comes to transitioning into the NHS system. It means that diagnosis matters and counts. It shouldn't be that way, but unfortunately it is. Make sure they're recognised. It's a lot cheaper than an autism diagnosis, which is something we were relieved about, but it was certainly a way to go, especially with the way things are at the moment and the waiting lists. For my son, I didn't want to wait till he transitioned to high school and then having to suddenly deal with all this. It would have taken that long for him to be diagnosed at the moment. Basically, that's our short little story of how we've come to realise that our family is a little more neurodivergent than we originally thought, and we've got this fantastic, spectrum of different neurodivergencies that go on in our home, and it's a wonderful thing. It has its challenges, but it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. If you think you may be ADHD, do check out the videos I've got on ADHD. Do get it followed up. But remember, it's your choice what you do. If you think your kids might have ADHD, again, follow it up, see a GP, make your decisions based on what's right for you guys. If it's not an urgent thing, by all means, go through the NHS and that period, but it is just such a long wait at the moment. There are options out there. It's not cheap, but it's not as expensive as it could be. It cost us just over $1,000 to do it. So it's there, it's out there. I'd love to hear your experiences. If you've had anything similar happen to you guys, can you please pop it in the comments? When you guys share your experiences, it makes these things so much richer, because that information is things that other people are reading about, and your stories matter. I'd love to hear about it if you've had similar experiences with different kids in your household and the different presentations of different neurodivergencies and how that's affected you guys. Did you notice it? Was it the same situation as us? It's a really interesting thing to cover, so please do pop that in the comments and let us know your stories. It does make a huge difference. I'll see you again on the next episode. In the meantime, please do stay safe.